The wedding with Mark was a magical event. We met at a prestigious hotel in the big city, and our romance blossomed quickly. On that day, I felt like a princess in my white dress, and Mark looked magnificent in his classic suit. Our family and friends surrounded us with warm smiles and congratulations, and the ceremony was filled with emotions. When we exchanged vows of eternal love and fidelity, tears of joy flowed from everyone's eyes. After the wedding, we went on our honeymoon to Alaska. Amidst the snowy landscapes and under the northern lights, we enjoyed seclusion and romance. Those weeks became a true paradise for us, full of unforgettable moments. Upon returning to the big city, we were met with an unexpected proposal from Mark's father, George. He offered Mark a high-paying position as the manager of a livestock complex in a rural area. Initially, I had doubts about such a drastic change in our lives, but I was willing to do anything for Mark. After lengthy discussions and weighing all the pros and cons, we decided to move. The move was challenging but exciting. We packed all our belongings and set off. The road to the countryside was long and scenic. Along the way, we talked about our hopes and dreams for the future, enjoying the views and anticipating our new life. When we arrived in the village, George greeted us. He was happy to see his son and me. George, a tall and sturdy man with kind eyes, immediately began showing us our new home. The old farmhouse looked cozy and welcoming. I couldn't help but notice the effort that had gone into maintaining and beautifying it. We started settling into the house, unpacking and arranging furniture. I tried to adapt to the new conditions and find my place in this new world. Each day, I grew more accustomed to the quiet and peace that rural life offered. The beginning of our new life on the farm was full of hope and anticipation. Despite all the doubts and fears, I believed that our love would help us overcome any challenges. And although we did not yet know what lay ahead, we were ready to face all the difficulties together. The first few weeks in the village were a true test for us. Life at the livestock complex was nothing like what I was used to in the city. Morning mists, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the sounds of rural life. Everything was new and surprising to me. Mark, deeply engrossed in his new job, quickly integrated into the community. He eagerly took on new responsibilities, met local residents, and strived to present himself in the best possible light. As for me, left alone in our new home, I set about making it our own. Every corner needed attention and care. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, these tasks filled my days. However, despite the daily chores, I found time to explore the surroundings and learn about life on the farm. One of my favorite activities became spending time in the garden with George. He taught me how to care for the plants, showing me different techniques of agronomy and organic farming. George turned out to be an incredibly knowledgeable and patient teacher. Under his guidance, I learned a lot about growing vegetables and fruits, how to properly care for the garden and keep it in good condition. Our garden sessions not only enriched me with new knowledge, but also became a time for conversation. George shared stories from his life, telling me about his childhood and how he built this house and farm from scratch. There was pride and love for this place in his voice. In return, I shared with him stories about my life in the city, the dreams and plans Mark and I had made. Gradually, I began to find my rhythm in this new life. Morning runs on dewy grass, evening sit-downs on the veranda with a cup of tea. All of this filled my days with peace and harmony. The beauty of the rural landscape, its calmness and tranquility, became a real revelation for me. Communicating with George became an integral part of my life on the farm. In his company, I felt comfortable and safe. We often discussed our dreams and plans for the future, exchanging thoughts and ideas. These conversations brought us closer, creating a special bond that I couldn't explain. With each day, I became more and more immersed in the new life, found joy in simple things, and savored every moment. Life on the farm turned out to be not as daunting as I initially thought. I began to feel like a part of this place, a part of this land and nature. The first few weeks on the farm flew by unnoticed. Mark spent more and more time at work, focusing on expanding the farming business. He immersed himself in new responsibilities, interacting with local residents, and establishing business contacts. This left me and George alone on the farm for extended periods. George and I began spending more time together. Initially, these were simple household tasks: cleaning, cooking, working in the garden. George turned out to be a great companion and teacher. He showed me how to properly care for the plants, shared his knowledge and experience. These activities not only enriched me with new skills, but also became a time for conversation. Our conversations grew increasingly personal. George would tell me about his childhood, how he built the farm from scratch, about his wife, and Mark as a child. His voice carried not only pride, but also a deep longing for the past. In return, I shared my memories of life in the city, the dreams and hopes Mark and I had. I started looking forward to these moments with George. In his presence, I found the comfort and support I lacked in Mark's absence. Walking together through the fields and forests became our favorite activity. We exchanged memories and stories, enjoying the beauty of the nature surrounding us. Gradually, I began to notice internal changes in my feelings towards George. These changes were complex and contradictory. On one hand, I felt deep gratitude and respect for his support and care. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the emerging feelings that frightened me with their strength and suddenness. These doubts and contradictions began to occupy my thoughts more and more. I felt like I was on a dangerous edge but couldn't stop this process. Each meeting with George, every conversation only intensified my confusion and anxiety. I knew these feelings were wrong, but I couldn't rid myself of them. Mark left for a neighboring town for a few days to finalize business contracts, leaving me and George alone on the farm. The tension between us grew, accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon. Every movement, every glance seemed charged with inevitability. One evening, George and I decided to make homemade cider to distract ourselves. Working side by side, we chopped apples, discussed recipes, and laughed over funny stories. At one point, our hands accidentally touched, and I felt a powerful electric charge run through my entire body. George looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the same tension and desire that I felt. The air between us became thick, like syrup, as we continued working in silence. When the cider was ready, George suddenly confessed his feelings. He said he had long felt something more for me than friendship, but couldn't bring himself to say it. I was shocked, but couldn't deny my own emotions. Deep down, I knew I felt something more for him too. Before I could respond, our lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and passionate. This kiss quickly turned into something more. The house was quiet. Only our breaths filled the space, becoming increasingly frequent and interrupted. I felt his hands gently touching my skin, as if he feared this was just a dream that might dissipate at any moment. George traced his fingers along my face, down my neck, as if studying every contour, every curve. His touches were tender, but with each passing second they became more confident. I felt his warmth seeping through my clothes, his fingers like an artist, painting invisible patterns on my body. Every movement, every touch was filled with such passion and desire that I couldn't resist. I felt him pulling me closer, our bodies becoming one, leaving no space between us. When our bodies finally joined, the world around us disappeared. It was just us, our sensations, and our breaths. I felt his fingers digging into my skin, holding me gently but firmly. We moved in unison, like two dancers, our dance full of passion and emotion. Every movement, every touch was like music, a melody we created together. I felt his warmth overflowing me, his hands gently but confidently exploring every inch of my body. We lost ourselves in that moment, in our passion, and all that existed were our bodies merging into one. When it was over, reality hit us both. We realized we had committed a betrayal. We had betrayed Mark. But alongside the guilt, I couldn't deny that those moments were incredibly important to me. It was the beginning of our secret relationship, full of contradictions and clandestine meetings. After our first betrayal, the world around us changed. George and I continued our secret meetings, always finding seclusion in places where no one could catch us. Our sanctuary became the old Hayloft, where every touch and whisper remained our secrets. The hayloft, with its scent of hay and the soft light filtering through the cracks, became a place where we could be ourselves. One day we had a picnic by the lake, hidden from prying eyes by trees and bushes. I prepared a light lunch, and George brought a bottle of wine. We lay on a blanket, enjoying the peace and tranquility, and every moment was filled with happiness and closeness. We laughed, shared stories from our lives, and dreamed of how things could have been different. These moments were treasures to us, but the constant feeling of guilt weighed heavily on our hearts. I tried to rationalize my actions, convincing myself that Mark was too busy with work, that he had stopped noticing me. But every time I returned home, I felt the guilt and fear growing inside me. Conversations with George about the future often ended with us realizing the impossibility of our long-term relationship, but we couldn't stop. Returning to everyday life with Mark became torturous. I tried not to show my feelings, but inside, my heart was breaking. Every touch, every kiss from Mark reminded me that I had betrayed his trust. I saw how tired he was from work, how hard he tried to provide for us, and the guilt became unbearable. Despite all the moral dilemmas and the threat of being exposed, the desire to be with George didn't wane. Every meeting was full of passion and understanding that I didn't find in my relationship with Mark. George became someone who understood me without words, who shared my dreams and fears. Our secret meetings continued, and each time I promised myself it would be the last. But as soon as we were together, all promises and resolutions were forgotten. Our feelings were stronger than reason, and stopping this surge seemed impossible. One of our secret evenings, George and I met again in the old hayloft. This place had become our sanctuary, our private world where we could forget everything else and enjoy each other. But that day, everything went wrong. We were lost in the moment, completely overtaken by passion. I felt his arms around me, his breath, hot and heavy, against my skin. Our bodies moved in unison, and the world around us seemed distant and non-existent. But suddenly, the door to the hayloft swung open, and there stood Alex, one of the farm workers. His eyes widened in shock and surprise, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then he let out a loud gasp and stepped back as if he had seen something unimaginable. "What is going on here?" he shouted, his voice trembling with indignation. George and I pulled away from each other, trying to comprehend what was happening. "Alex, it's not what you think," George began, raising his hands in a calming gesture. But Alex was adamant. "I've seen enough. How could you? Mark trusts you, and this is how you betray him." George tried to calm him, stepping closer. "Listen, Alex, I know how it looks, but let us explain." But Alex wouldn't listen, his face contorted with anger. "No, I'm not going to listen to your excuses. Mark needs to know the truth, and he will, whether you tell him or I do." I felt panic engulf me. What would happen now? George turned to me, his face tense and serious. "He's right, Emily. We can't hide anymore. I'll tell Mark." The next day, George met with Mark in the farm office. I stayed in the house, my thoughts racing from fear to remorse. Time dragged on endlessly as I waited to hear the outcome of their conversation. When Mark returned home, his face was twisted with rage and pain. He stormed into the house, and I immediately knew he was aware. "How could you, Emily?" His voice trembled with emotion. "With my father? How could you betray me so cruelly?" I tried to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. "Mark, I didn't mean for this to happen. It all happened so quickly, and But he cut me off. "Didn't mean to? That's no excuse. You destroyed everything we had." His reaction was a mixture of rage, pain, and utter disappointment. He glanced at George, who stood in the doorway, not daring to come closer. "And you, Father, how could you? I always trusted you, and you betrayed me." Those words hung in the air, and the silence became unbearable. Mark gathered his things and left, leaving us standing in the empty house. My life, like George's, was now in ruins, and we had no idea how to pick up the pieces. Mark, having gathered his things, left the farm. His face was stern, his eyes full of pain and disappointment. George and I stood by the front door, unable to say a word. The sounds of his footsteps and the closing car door echoed through the silent house. At that moment, I realized it was over, and there was no going back. My life, which seemed stable and happy, collapsed in an instant. The realization that my marriage was destroyed hit me with unbearable force. I looked at the empty room, at the things Mark left behind, and understood that the past would never return. The farm workers quickly learned about what happened. Their looks became cold and judgmental. I felt their disdain every time I walked by. Whispering behind my back, sideways glances, all of this became part of my daily life. No one looked at me with the respect they once had. I had become an outcast, a subject of gossip and condemnation. George felt this burden as well. We understood that our romance couldn't continue. Each day spent near him reminded me of the betrayal and pain we had caused Mark. We made the difficult decision to part ways. Those last days together were filled with bitterness and remorse. We knew this was the end, that our future could not be together. I tried to contact Mark, called him, wrote messages, begged for a meeting, but everything was in vain. He didn't respond to my attempts to explain and apologize. Each day of waiting was excruciating. I understood that he no longer wanted to hear anything from me. Gradually, I realized the necessity of leaving the farm. Here, in these walls, every corner reminded me of the ruined marriage and what I had lost. I knew I needed to start a new life elsewhere, far from everything associated with the past. Gathering my things, I left the farm. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I had to go to find a path to healing and a new life. Saying goodbye to George was brief and painful. We knew this was the end of our shared journey. I left with a heavy heart, but with hope that ahead lay a new life where I could find myself and start over. Receiving the divorce papers was the final nail in the coffin of my shattered marriage. When I saw them in the mailbox, my heart clenched with pain. Signing the papers, I realized that my marriage with Mark was officially over. This act of signing symbolized the end of a chapter that once seemed eternal. Signing the documents, I felt mixed emotions. On one hand, there was relief that the process was finally over. On the other hand, the realization of the consequences of my actions hit with renewed force. I had destroyed our life, our future. Conversations with Mark now took place only through lawyers. We discussed the final division of property and the completion of legal formalities. Each such conversation reminded me of what we had lost. The process was long and painful but necessary. Emotional recovery proved even more difficult. Every day I struggled with guilt and loss. I tried to start over step by step. There were days when I wanted to give up, but I knew I had to keep going. A new life awaited me, and I decided to do everything to find my place in it. After moving to a new city, I found a job at a small coffee shop on the corner of a quiet street. This place became a haven of peace and stability in a sea of changes and pain. Working as a barista gave me the opportunity to focus on simple things and rebuild my life step by step. Every morning, I opened the coffee shop, prepared fresh pastries, and poured the first cups of coffee for regular customers. In these moments when I was busy with work, I managed to forget the past and focus on the present. Gradually, I began to overcome the feeling of guilt and pain. I found new hobbies. I signed up for painting classes and started running in the park in the mornings. These small steps helped me find joy in life and set new goals. Sometimes I received calls from George. Our conversations were full of awkwardness and regrets. We both understood that the past couldn't be changed and tried to let it go. These calls reminded me that I needed to move forward and not hold on to the past. I started meeting new people, coffee shop customers, colleagues from painting classes. They all became part of my new life. Despite past mistakes, I tried to establish my personal life. It wasn't easy, but I knew it was important not to shut myself off. From time to time, I delved into reflections about the past. I analyzed my actions, trying to understand what lessons I had learned from what happened. These reflections helped me realize my mistakes and understand how to become better and stronger. Gradually, I began the journey to self-awareness and self-forgiveness. I realized that to move forward, I needed to accept myself with all my flaws and mistakes. It was a long and difficult process, but I was ready for new challenges and opportunities that life had in store for me. Almost a year had passed since my divorce from Mark. This year was full of challenges, but I felt stronger and more confident than ever before. I had built a new life in the city, but something kept pulling me back. I knew it was time to return to the farm and meet with George to discuss our future. Returning to the farm, I felt mixed emotions. Memories flooded back, but I knew I had to take this step. When I saw George standing on the porch, my heart raced. He looked older, but the same warmth and care in his eyes that had always drawn me in were still there. We sat on the old bench by the house, and George confessed his feelings. He said he thought of me every day and that his feelings hadn't changed. He asked me to stay with him and start a new life together. His words were filled with sincerity and hope. I was silent for a long time, considering everything that had happened. The judgment of others and the severed relationship with Mark loomed over us like dark clouds. But deep down, I knew I loved George and that our feelings deserved a chance. "I agree," I finally said. "Let's try to start over." George smiled, and joy lit up his eyes. We began building a new life together. Working on restoring the farm became our shared goal, and every day we spent together, supporting and helping each other. Our relationship grew stronger each day, and I felt that we could truly be happy. My final reflections were filled with hope and gratitude. I realized that life is full of challenges, but there is value in every moment. I was grateful for all the lessons I had learned from the past and for the opportunity to start anew. I decided to strive for better, to cherish every moment, and to believe in a bright future.